Welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into some really fascinating stuff today. The thought of Nicole Oresme.
Oresme.
Yeah.
A 14th century scholastic philosopher.
He's someone who, our sources really emphasize as, he was known for his original ideas.
Absolutely.
And an independence of thought.
Real independence.
Yeah, that really led him to critique even, the big guy, Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
So for you listening, if you're someone interested in the history of philosophy, how these ideas develop, Oresme is a really interesting case study. He's considered, a major precursor to modern mathematics and science.
For sure.
He's been called the greatest medieval economist, which is pretty wild when you think about it. And he's also known for his translations. He translated Aristotle
That's right.
into French, major works of Aristotle, like the Ethics.
Yeah.
The Politics on the Heavens, and even some pseudo-Aristotelian works like the Economist.
Economics, yeah.
And those translations, they really played a big role in shaping the vocabulary of, French science and philosophy.
So hugely influential.
Hugely influential. So basically what we're doing today is we're going to try to really get into the mind of this pivotal thinker who's really wrestling with these really fundamental philosophical questions in a way that's actually surprisingly ingenious,
Yeah.
So we'll be exploring that.
Yeah. And what we want to do in this deep dive specifically is to look at some of the key contributions that Oresme made to philosophy.
Okay.
Especially those that challenged the dominant, Aristotelian views of the time.
Okay.
And so we're going to draw mostly from his commentaries on Aristotle's physics.
Okay.
And look at how this, 14th century mind really sort of moves beyond the established framework.
Yeah.
We're going to focus particularly on, his innovative ideas concerning the ontological status of accidents.
Yeah.
And then we'll delve into, his very non-Aristotelian conceptions of place and space and time.
Okay.
Which will hopefully, as someone interested in philosophy,
Yeah.
this will give you, a good understanding of sort of the crucial shifts that were happening in medieval intellectual history.
Got it. Okay.
And also the originality with which, Oresme approached these, really enduring questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
And let's start with his his view of accidents.
Right.
The ontological status of accidents. Now, traditionally, when we talk about the properties of things, like their color, their shape, even their motion, these were often seen as separate accidental forms that sort of inhered in a substance.
Yeah.
But Oresme had a very different way of seeing this.
He did.
did.
He considered these properties, these accidents, not as, independently existing forms, but rather as conditiones or modi, ways in which a substance is. So, our sources give some really good examples here.
Okay.
So, motion. He saw motion as a way of, a substance being sort of in flux.
Right.
Being in a place, or esse in loco, like the scholastics would say.
Mm-hmm.
The quantity of a substance, esse tantum, right?
Okay.
And qualities like, esse album being white.
Right.
And what's really cool here, I think, for, us thinking about this philosophically, is that, while Oresme distinguished these conditiones from, the underlying substance, he gave them a lower ontological status
Okay.
than the traditional, accidental forms.
Right.
So instead of having a separate whiteness form existing, in a white object,
Right.
whiteness is just a particular way that object exists.
Okay.
It's a more, I think, parsimonious
Yeah.
and maybe more elegant way
Right.
of understanding the relationship between a thing and its properties.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It's instead of having all these extra forms floating around.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's just this is how the thing is.
This is how the thing is.
Yeah.
Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting.
Okay.
Because our source points out a connection to the complexly signifiables theory,
They're plexly signifiables, yeah.
which is associated with Adam Ornum
Mm-hmm.
and Gregory of Rimini.
Yeah.
Now, for folks who are, into philosophy,
Right.
that term probably rings a bell. But can you sort of unpack that a bit?
Yeah.
What's the connection here and what's the difference?
Yeah.
What are they trying to do differently?
Right. So the complexly signifiables theory basically has to do with the object of knowledge. Specifically, what a proposition as a whole signifies, like the significatum total, as they say.
Right.
So, for example, the proposition, a human is white,
Mm-hmm.
signifies not just human and white separately,
Right.
but the complex fact that a human is white.
Got it.
Right. And what's really interesting is Oresme himself sometimes uses the expression complex significably, you know? Okay.
When he's talking about his ontology of accidents.
Okay. Yeah.
But the difference really lies in their main philosophical goals.
Okay.
So Oresme's main concern was ontological. Like, what is an accident in the realm of being?
Okay.
Whereas Woodham and Rimini were more focused on an epistemological question, like,
Yeah.
what is it that we know when we grasp the truth of a proposition?
Got it.
Yeah.
So it's like they're using similar tools,
Yeah,
but to get at different problems.
exactly. And as our source emphasizes, Woodham and Rimini's theory was much broader.
Okay.
It wasn't just about propositions about accidents.
Okay.
It applied to any statement, like God exists, so
Ah, yeah.
human is an animal.
Right. Right.
And their point wasn't to say that, like,
Yeah.
accidents are these complexly signifiables.
Right.
Right. But Oresme's situation was different
Mm-hmm.
because he rejected these separate accidental forms.
Right.
He needed a way to talk about accidents
Right.
without using, substantive terms.
Mhm.
So, like, describing motion as a fluxus,
Yeah.
a way of a substance being in motion.
Right.
That sort of achieves this.
Right.
Right.
And this formulation, it kind of, resembles the complexly signifiables theory, but not because that was his main goal,
Right.
but because it fit with his, existing ontological framework.
Got it.
Yeah. So it really shows how, these underlying metaphysical commitments can actually shape
Yeah.
the very language
That's really interesting.
and the conceptual tools that a philosopher develops. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so moving on.
Yeah. Let's move on.
Let's look at his non-Aristotelian concepts of place and space.
Right. Yeah.
Now, Aristotle famously defined place as the innermost surface of the surrounding body,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty relational view.
It is. It is. Yeah.
But Oresme, along with some of his predecessors,
Mhm.
they envisioned it very differently.
They did. Yeah.
What was his alternative conception of place? So for Oresme, physical place wasn't about, a boundary or a surface,
Right.
but the space that's actually filled or occupied by the body itself.
Okay.
And he wasn't alone in this.
Right.
Our source mentions,
Yeah.
Geraldus Odonis,
Mm-hmm.
Walter Chatton,
Okay.
William Craythorne, as people who had also argued for this kind of understanding of place.
Okay. Yeah.
Even Petrus Orioli, while different, had also offered an alternative to Aristotle
Right.
by defining place as like a determinate position in the universe.
Got it.
So this is really important.
Yeah.
It shows us that there was like a real current of, dissatisfaction with Aristotle's definition of place
Yeah.
within medieval thought.
Yeah.
And Oresme's contribution sort of, it really bolstered
Yeah.
this alternative perspective.
Right. Right. And I mean, this idea of place as occupied space, I mean, this has some pretty intriguing echoes
It does, yeah.
with later philosophical developments
Oh, absolutely.
and scientific developments. Our source even positions him as a precursor to Newton's theory of absolute space.
Mhm.
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it is a big connection,
Right.
And the similarity lies in that shared intuition.
Yeah.
That place is fundamentally about
Yeah.
the spatial volume that a body occupies.
Right.
But, and this is really key for us, as philosophers, the ontological status of space itself was totally different
Okay.
between Oresme and Newton.
Yeah.
So for Oresme, space wasn't a substance,
Right.
and it wasn't an accident
Okay.
in the traditional, Aristotelian sense.
Right.
He thought it was something signified by, like, adverbs,
Okay.
like here and there.
Got it.
And it didn't have the independent being of a substance
Okay.
or the inherence of an accident.
Right.
And this puts space on a much lower ontological level
Okay.
compared to Newton's absolute space,
Right.
which kind of approached like a quasi-substantial status, as our source mentions.
Right. Right. So it's like they have a similar idea of what place is,
Yeah.
like the occupied volume.
Occupied volume.
But their bigger picture,
Their
metaphysics of space,
Yeah.
is really different.
It's really different.
Now, what's really interesting is Oresme's idea of an extracosmic infinite void space.
Yeah. Infinite void space.
This is like a direct challenge to the Aristotelian model
Totally.
of a finite cosmos.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what were his arguments for like positing this void like beyond the outermost sphere?
Well, so he lays out his arguments for an infinite void, beyond the cosmos in a bunch of his works, notably in Le Livre du Ciel et du Monde.
Okay.
And his question is super de cello. And his reasoning often revolves around this idea that God's power is infinite.
Okay.
And so there's no good reason to think that he couldn't have created a world bigger than the finite Aristotelian one,
Right.
which implies space beyond it, right?
Right.
And what's interesting is he's not alone in this.
Right. Right.
Our source mentions other medieval philosophers,
Yeah.
like Hasdai Crescus, Thomas Bradwardine,
Okay.
Robert Holcott, William Craythorne. They all entertain the possibility of like an infinite void
Okay.
beyond the actual physical universe.
Right.
So this is like a real intellectual shift
Right.
away from the strictly limited cosmos of Aristotle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then he takes it a step further.
Yeah.
Right?
He does, yeah.
He goes on to identify this infinite void space with God himself.
Right.
Which is, I mean, that's a pretty unique and theologically charged conclusion.
It's kind of like a really distinctive hallmark of Oresme's natural philosophy and theology.
Right, yeah.
He saw this, immense unbounded reality
Right.
outside of, the finite heavens
Right.
as like being coextensive with God,
Okay.
with the divine essence.
Right.
But, as our source correctly points out,
Yeah.
Other medieval philosophers who also proposed this infinite void, like Crescus
Yeah.
and Bradwardine, they didn't necessarily make this same theological identification.
Right.
And so this shows like Oresme's kind of tendency to like really integrate
Right.
his philosophical inquiries with his theological convictions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to his understanding of time.
Okay, yeah.
Because just as he had like a non-Aristotelian view of place and space, he also departs from Aristotle's definition of time.
He does.
Right.
Yeah.
Aristotle famously defined time as like the number or measure of motion.
That's right.
So what was Oresme's alternative?
So Oresme defined time as the successive duration of things.
Okay.
Duratio rerum successiva.
Duratio rerum successiva.
Okay.
Okay. And this is really a key point of difference.
Yeah.
Oresme's definition sees time as like a fundamental aspect of existence.
Right. It's inherent in the very being of things as they persist through time.
Okay.
Right, rather than being just a measure of change.
Okay.
So for Aristotle, time was totally tied to motion.
Okay.
Without motion, there's no time.
Right.
But Oresme, he conceived of duration as prior to and independent of any actual movement.
Got it.
Yeah.
And it seems like he wasn't the first to kind of have issues with Aristotle on this point.
No, not at all.
Right. Our source mentions like Petrus Johannes Olivi and Gerardus Adonis as earlier critics.
That's right. Yeah, so Olivi had criticized Aristotle for basically making motion the primary subject of time.
Right.
Rather than the being of things.
Right.
And Gerardus Adonis also argued for the independence of time from motion.
Right.
So again, we see Oresme contributing to this line of critique against, core tenets of Aristotelian physics that was already developing.
That's really interesting. And like with his concept of space, our source suggests that his theory of time also has some resemblance to like how we understand time in classical physics.
It does. But again, like with space, we have to be careful about the ontological implications.
Right.
Right. Oresme's idea of time as, this fundamental successive duration of existence, not just dependent on physical change.
Right.
It does line up kind of closely
with
this concept of absolute time in classical physics.
Okay.
But Oresme didn't necessarily give time the same kind of like independent, almost substantial reality that it would acquire in later theories.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And then finally, there's his concept of eternity.
Right.
Which he connects to his understanding of time.
Yeah.
And again, back to his theological framework.
And again, to theology. Yeah.
Right.
So for Oresme, eternity is the duration of things.
Okay.
But without succession.
Without succession.
Duratio ris ruum totissimo.
duratio revum tota simul.
Okay.
And just as he identified the infinite void space with God, he also identifies this idea of like a unified, non-successive duration eternity with the very being of God.
Okay. Okay.
So again, this emphasizes that, deep interconnectedness between his philosophy and his theology.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears slightly.
Sure.
And talk about Oresme's theory of motion.
Right.
So our source describes this as his conditio theory applied to motion.
Right.
So for folks trying to figure out like the nature of change,
Yeah.
what does this theory actually say?
Right. So Oresme saw motion, which he called fluxus,
Okay.
as a successive entity that exists alongside the moving object and its, states as it's moving. And this is subtle, but it's really important.
Okay.
It means that his view is somewhere between, like a purely nominalist view, which might say that motion is just a name we give to a bunch of static states, and a more like realist view.
Okay. That says that motion is like a separate accidental form.
Right.
And our source mentions Buridan as someone who seemed to hold that second view, at least for local motion.
Okay.
So Oresme's conditio theory is like a middle ground.
Oh, okay.
He says motion is real.
Okay.
It's not an illusion.
Right.
It's not just a name.
Right.
But it's also ontologically dependent on the object that's moving.
Right.
So it's a modus se habendi. It's a way of the object being like in flux, a conditio.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this concept of fluxus, I mean, he really wanted this to be like a unified concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Applicable to all kinds of change.
Yeah, that was his goal. He wanted to have this coherent and unified understanding of motion.
Right.
That could handle like, alteration, changes in quality,
right,
changes in quantity, locomotion.
Yeah.
This was like a big ambition for him.
Right.
And it's kind of unfortunate, as our source points out, that later thinkers didn't always like fully get it. Right.
Or appreciate this unified approach.
Right.
Some even like mistakenly thought it was the same as Occam's view.
Right.
Which is more nominalist.
Right.
On motion.
Right.
So it's kind of a reminder that even original and carefully articulated ideas can get, misinterpreted or overlooked.
Yeah.
As intellectual history unfolds.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So to kind of bring it all together for you, our listeners out there who are into philosophy.
Yeah.
Nicole Oresme really emerges as a hugely important figure.
Absolutely.
His challenges to these like fundamental Aristotelian ideas, whether it's, rethinking the nature of accidents or his like totally groundbreaking ideas about place, space, time, and motion.
Right.
All of that, I think, shows a really sharp and independent mind.
Yeah.
That's wrestling with, some of the biggest questions in metaphysics.
Big question. And natural philosophy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And his work shows like this really vibrant period of intellectual ferment within scholasticism.
Yep.
Right. Where people are pushing the boundaries.
Defend the boundaries.
Of established thought in ways that are like, are really interesting to us now.
Absolutely.
Because they seem like surprisingly modern in some ways.
Yeah, they do. They really do.
Right.
Yeah, and for you, I think engaging with Oresme's thought gives you this like really valuable window into how complex and dynamic medieval philosophy really was.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like a period of, blindly following the classical authorities.
Right.
There was genuine intellectual innovation.
Right.
And a willingness to question even the most, entrenched beliefs.
Right.
And Oresme is like a perfect example of this.
Yeah, he really is.
And his perspectives are still relevant. When we think about, what is the nature of reality?
Yeah.
What is change? What is our place in the cosmos?
Yeah.
Big questions.
Yeah, and that leads us to our final thought for you,
Okay.
So I kind of chew on. Given Oresme's like incredible intellectual independence and willingness to challenge like the fundamental beliefs of his time. What ideas in our own contemporary philosophical landscape might be ready for that same kind of like rigorous, critical reevaluation?
Yeah, it's a good question to ask.
It's something to think about, right?
It is, yeah.
So it's really an invitation to like follow Oresme's lead and keep keep pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry.
Keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.